It is indeed a pleasure for me to return here now and introduce our keynote speaker this evening, because I was a lowly White House staffer and I looked up to this man as he was leading the White House staff in the Reagan administration as in intergovernmental relations, and then later in Bush 41 as the Deputy Chief of Staff. Andrew Card is acting dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service, serving as the school's leader while Dean Ryan Crocker is on leave as the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan. As a member of the committee currently guiding the Campaign for Principled Leadership, Secretary Card has responded to the challenge of securing the school's future by serving in a new and important role in its rise to preeminence. He brings to this position many years of successful experience in managing public sector organizations, shaping public policy, and serving 3 American presidents. At the national level, Mr. Card served in President Reagan's administration, where I first saw him, as Special Assistant to the President for Intergovernmental Affairs and as Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of Intergovernmental Affairs. So a young guy was watching an older gentleman who was making it happen. Again, mentoring, very important from afar. He served as Assistant to the President and Deputy Chief of Staff in the George H.W. Bush administration, where he managed the daily operations of the White House staff and participated in the full range of economic, foreign, and domestic policy development. Mr. Card also served as the 11th U.S. Secretary of Transportation under former President Bush 41 and directed the presidential transition from the Bush administration to the Clinton administration, a difficult but important task, continuity of government. In November of 2000, Mr. Card was appointed Chief of Staff for President George W. Bush, and he served in that position for 5.5 years, longer than any other person has ever served a president as Chief of Staff. Prior to his federal roles, Mr. Card served at the state level in the Massachusetts House of Representatives and in the private sector as President and Chief Executive Officer of the American Automobile Manufacturers Association and Vice President of Government Relations for General Motors. Secretary Card earned his Bachelor's of Science degree in engineering from the University of South Carolina and attended the United States Merchant Marine Academy and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome Secretary Andrew Card.
Howdy. All right. I have to apologize to all of you because I park the car at Harvard Yard every once in a while. You know what I'm saying. And it's a particular challenge when I have to talk about 2 people that I really love. One is Archie Dunham and his wife, Linda. Archie really is a remarkable man. And you know, we all have a great friend in Jesus. But Archie Dunham is a great friend because he invites Jesus into everybody else's life. So, thank you, Archie. Sharon Saunders is here. And I understand that she gets to exercise a phenomenal privilege most mornings when she gets to say, "Good morning, Mr. President." So thank you, Sharon, for putting the President in a good mood every day. I'm here because I had that privilege for a president. It wasn't a privilege that I sought, but it was a privilege that changed my life. By the way, you don't apply to be the President's Chief of Staff. It's not a situation where you have the President go to monster.com and find a resume. Some of you may remember the story of how I was asked to be the Chief of Staff, but I didn't know I was being asked to be the Chief of Staff. But that's another story. I thought that I would share with you my faith and my experiences. And experiences that showed me how faith is really, really important if you have to make any decision. And the people that I worked with had to make unbelievably tough decisions. In fact, I don't know if Sharon would say this about President Sloan, but if presidents are making an easy decision, the chief of staff hasn't done his or her job. So presidents make brutally tough decisions. And I thought I would share how I observed faith making it possible for them to make tough decisions. Like Archie, I'm blessed to have a blessing in my life who will be with me, there's not a doubt, during my entire life, and I hope and suspect for eternity. And that's my wife, Kathleen, who is here tonight, and I met her in the 5th grade. She doesn't acknowledge me before the 6th grade. And in the 7th grade, she said she didn't want to be with me. So thank you, Kathleen, for being with me and being such a supporter. I cite my wife because we are either an oxymoron or two parallel lines that ended up intersecting. She is church, I have been state. The good news is, while we have the separation of church and state, we don't have separation of governing and faith. And my wife made sure that the role of governing was always better informed by faith. I'm a very early morning person. Archie is a very early morning person. We usually get up at 4 a.m., my wife and I. And we've been doing it for a very, very, very long time. It was easy for me because I delivered newspapers all through high school. And that was morning newspapers, so I always got up early in the morning. My wife was a night person who got up very early in the morning to be with me. But we wake up in the morning at a very interesting time. 4:08 a.m. Why? Because there is a passage in the Bible that guides our day. Philippians 4:8. I've greeted you with a howdy, which means I live in Aggie land. Aggie land is a place of great traditions. And those traditions have even inculcated this Yankee who was educated at South Carolina. So I know those words that define an Aggie. Excellence, integrity, leadership, loyalty, respect, and selfless service. I know those words because I've seen them personified in someone. George Herbert Walker Bush. And I'm in Aggie land because he asked if I would come and be the acting dean at the Bush School while Dean Ryan Crocker was off serving his country as a patriot. But what a blessing it was to come into Aggie land and learn that George Bush's life is described in the values of Texas A&M. He really is excellence and integrity and leadership and loyalty and respect and selfless service. So it was easy for me to say yes. I'd go to Aggie land. I'm not sure it was easy for my wife to say she would join me. She had her own church. And when President Bush asked if I would be the acting dean, and Barbara Bush told me to be the acting dean, my wife acquiesced, and she got a leave of absence from her church in McLean, Virginia, and we jumped in with both feet to the community of Aggie land. We were there for 3 weeks, and then my wife was asked if she'd be the interim pastor at a United Methodist Church. So she has been doing that. And that has also brought us close to the community that really is a special community. But that's a choice that neither one of us expected. Why did we do it? Why would we, from Holbrook, Massachusetts, come to Texas? Why would we have taken the opportunities that we have taken in life? You want to know something? It's because of faith. I really, really embraced the words trust and obey. And those words are words of faith because we have to trust to have our faith. Too few of us have the courage to obey. Too few of us find that it takes prayer to discover how to obey. So my wife and I prayed over all of these opportunities that I've had. The invitation to be a chief of staff that I didn't apply for. The responsibilities to move from a comfortable hometown of Holbrook, Massachusetts, to an uncomfortable town of Washington, D.C., to a strange place called Texas, when it was hell outside, but all of the people living around us were angels, because it was 108 degrees when we arrived in College Station. But it is that trust and obey that frequently drives us. And I want more people to recognize how important it is. I grew up in a family where faith was very important. In the Dunham's Bible Museum, go out that door, take a left, take a right, and you'll be in it. And if you walk around and hear and see the story of the Word, and you make it near the end where you get into the section that talks about America, you'll see a picture of somebody named John Winthrop. The community that I grew up in, Holbrook, Massachusetts, has a church. It was my home church. It's the Winthrop Congregational Church. My home was right behind the church. My mother was always late for church. But I never missed Sunday school. And we were active in everything. And faith grounded the family. My grandmother lived right across the street from me. Faith grounded her. She was very active in the church. But there was something else that grounded her, and she taught us how to be grounded in that as well. And that was a document called the Constitution. So there were two documents that entered my life when I was very young. One started with "in the beginning," and the other one started with "we." My grandmother made sure that I understood what the beginning was like and what the path was to follow. But she also inculcated me with an expectation that I had to appreciate the word "we." See, my grandmother had been a suffragette. She fought for women to get the right to vote. She was a remarkable woman. She was a teacher. She was very well educated for her day. But she was also an activist. And there was a picture that hung in her dining room of all of these women wearing white dresses, and they were marching down Commonwealth Avenue in Boston. And she claims she's in the front row. Maybe she was. She fought for women to get the right to vote. And interestingly, only a few years ago, the town clerk in my hometown sent me a copy of some records from the town clerk's office. That's the elections officer, if you will, in the community. It was a photocopy of my grandmother's voter registration. She was the first woman to register to vote in the town of Holbrook right after women got the right to vote in 1920. Anyway, to make a long story short, dinner at my grandmother's house was always quite formal. We gathered around the table, and before we could begin a meal, we offered a blessing. And it wasn't just, grab the grub, thank God, and eat. No, it was a serious blessing. But before we could begin to really eat the meal and pick up the utensil to do it, my grandmother did something else. She challenged everyone at the table to repeat something from the newspaper that day. So as a result, every meal turned into an argument. And she loved it. We all knew the name of our local elected officials. We paid attention to what was going on with the school committee, or in Beacon Hill in Boston, or in Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And she told us that the most important word in the Constitution was that two-letter word, we. She said it was our government, and that the we applied to everyone. It was completely inclusive. It didn't say some of us. It was we, all of us. And that we had a responsibility to answer the invitation that the Constitution is. Because if you read the Constitution, it's really an invitation. But then she would say, accept the invitation. Because if you accept the invitation, you will then have to accept the obligation in the Constitution. Now, I know most of you define the Constitution by an amendment to the Constitution, the First Amendment. And that's a pretty important fact. And you know that First Amendment, it gives us the right to practice our faith the way we want to practice it without the government telling us how to. It gives us the right to talk freely about our government without the government telling us we can't. We also have the right of free association. We can come together with friends or foes. And we also have the right to petition government to address our grievances. That's that First Amendment. But my grandmother focused more on the entire Constitution than just saying, we can talk about it, we can pray about it, we can get our friends and complain about it, and we can then go complain about it. She said, read the Constitution. Accept the invitation. Embrace the obligation and keep it. That's what I tried to do. The invitation to serve in the White House, as Charles knows, that's a phenomenal invitation. Oh, I used to dream about visiting the White House. I truly never dreamed that I would be working at the White House. But when the invitation came to work at the White House, and guess who the invitation came from? Actually, Charles skipped something on the introduction. I had a forgettable campaign for governor of Massachusetts in 1982. I'll never forget it. My wife won't let me forget it. Everybody else has. But James A. Baker III, a pillar, not only in Houston, but for our nation and I think the world, called me after I lost that race for governor, and he said, how would you like to come to work in Washington, D.C. for President Reagan? And that's what brought me to Washington. An invitation I never expected, didn't apply for, but embraced. And I was pretty, full of myself, thinking I was going to drive my car right up to the White House, and my parking spot was right next to the vice president's limousine. Very cool. And then all of a sudden I realized, wait a minute, there are obligations that go with that invitation. And I came to see that the decisions were really hard. Even for a lowly staffer. My title was Special Assistant to the President for Intergovernmental Affairs. The longer the title, the less important you are. But I found even with that long title, I was called to make decisions. And they were really hard. Really controversial. I was the liaison to the nation's governors and statewide elected officials. They did not agree. There was no consensus. And I said, how do I do this? John Sununu was a governor. Ooh, he was a mean man. Mario Cuomo was a governor. Ooh, he was a mean man. And I found I had to go back to what my grandmother taught me. Faith. I had to be grounded. I needed to pray. I needed to seek. I also had to decide. And I thought that was tough. And then I saw that the president's decisions were much more difficult than my decisions. After all, my decisions could be erased by somebody else further up the chain of command. And then I had that invitation to serve as a deputy chief of staff. And that was a cool job. It was probably the best job I had in government. Everybody thinks chief of staff was. Too many people knew the chief of staff. Nobody knows the deputy chief of staff. Except for Karl Rove, everybody knew him. So I could make lots of decisions as deputy chief of staff, and everybody else would get blamed for them. But I found the toughest part of the job was actually managing the people, not managing the policy. Why? Because presidents attract the best and the brightest. And most of them have a type A personality. And they are right. Of course, you've got 8 right people, and only one of them will end up being right. So my job was to manage the process of those personalities so that there were no bullies in the process that didn't get the president to do something that he didn't decide to do. Instead, it was that somebody else decided he should do. And I learned a lot from that. And then I got that unbelievable invitation to serve as Secretary of Transportation. Believe it or not, I didn't know the president was going to pick me to be the Secretary of Transportation. My job was to get the president to pick somebody to be the Secretary of Transportation. Because Sam Skinner had left as Secretary of Transportation and was being named as Chief of Staff. And then I get called into the president's office very early in the morning. It was a Monday morning, and he's in his private office, off the Oval Office, and I'm standing in the doorway. He's sitting there with Secretary Skinner, who was the new Chief of Staff. And he says, "Andy, I'd like you to be the Secretary of Transportation." And I said, "Yeah, right." That's the truth. That's what I told him. He said, "No, I'm serious." Great job. Pretty heavy decisions. Lots of need for faith. Lots of need for wisdom. Yes, I went to Proverbs. I sought counsel. I looked for smart people. Then I looked for the Lord. Then we had the dark days, and I served in the private sector. And then the light came up. And I was invited to come back to the White House as Chief of Staff to the President. What an awesome responsibility. And Sharon, yes, it is a blessing to be able to say, "Good morning, Mr. President," when he walks into the Oval Office. And I reflected on the job that the President had. And that very first day, you remember it was cold, rainy, snowy in Washington, D.C. George W. Bush is called to come to the rostrum on the steps of the Capitol. Thousands and thousands of people to gather on the Mall. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court asked the President to place his left hand on a Bible, raise his right hand, and he's administered an oath. That oath comes right from that document that starts with "we," but this time he has to put an "I" there. And he takes an obligation. And it's an obligation that is written in the shortest way of anyone who takes a government obligation. The President's oath of office is the shortest oath taken by anyone who serves in government. It calls for him to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And I suspect when George W. Bush took that oath, he probably wasn't thinking too much about it. I think he was thinking about his inaugural address, where everybody had told him, "It's the most important speech you're ever going to give in your life." And he went up and he gave a great inaugural address. You should go back and read it. It was actually quite insightful. And then there was a parade down Pennsylvania Avenue, and most people were waving like this. There were a lot of single-digit hellos along the way. And the President stayed and watched the parade go by, didn't leave until every unit had gone by, showed respect for the people that were showing respect for the office of the President. But Kathleen and I were called over to the White House. Very cool phone call to get. It came from a janitor at the White House. He said, "Mr. Card, would you like to come over to the West Wing to check the Oval Office out to see if it's ready for the new president?" That's a cool call to get. And my wife and I left the reviewing stand and we went over to the White House lobby. We walked in, there's George Washington crossing the Delaware. We go through the Roosevelt Room, and Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt are highlighted there. You see Teddy Roosevelt's Nobel Peace Prize. Then you go into the Oval Office. Oh, it was beautiful. It might have been cold and damp and dark outside, but that office was bright and light and welcoming. You could still smell the paint drying. The Clinton rug had been rolled up and the Reagan rug had been put down. And I walked in and, oh, just looked fabulous. There's a workman working on the secure phone in the President's desk. Somebody else is setting pictures up on the table behind the President's desk of his family. And I go and stand beside the grandfather's clock, and I'm in awe. And then in walks the new president. And the truth is, I shouldn't have been there to witness it. I'm trying to hide in a corner, but there are no corners in the Oval Office. And the President walks across the rug. Right in the middle of the rug is the seal of the President of the United States. Over the President's head, in the ceiling, is the seal of the President of the United States. He stops and he turns around and he looks at the desk. It's the Resolute desk. Carved on the door of that desk is the seal of the President of the United States. Without saying a word, he goes and he sits behind the desk in the chair. And there was an electrical cord and there was kind of a buzzer on it, and he's going, "Whoa, what's this?" Didn't like it. And then all of a sudden, the door from the Rose Garden opens up. And a gentleman walks in and says, "Mr. President." And the president looks up and says, "Mr. President." It was his dad. They didn't say a word. The president stood. The other president walked. And they met each other in the middle of the rug, right underneath the seal of the president, right on top of the seal of the president, and right in front of the seal of the president. And there were tears in their eyes, and tears are streaming down my cheeks, because it's obvious they had tremendous mutual respect. Not just the respect of a father and a son, a mutual respect for the office of the president. It was then that the burden really weighed on me. I witnessed it. I had to help the president carry the burden. You know, the burdens are beyond comprehension for a president. The decisions are so tough. And they should be tough. After all, if the president is making an easy decision, he's making a government decision, and presidents need to make presidential decisions. But I was so proud how I saw President George W. Bush make his decisions. Oh, I was proud with his dad, and I was certainly proud of Ronald Reagan. They all had faith. They all practiced their faith. They all exercised their faith. They all lived their faith. Ronald Reagan wasn't a great church goer, but he's the one that got a chapel at Camp David, Evergreen Chapel. George H.W. Bush, strong man of faith, went to church every Sunday, read the Word. But it was George W. Bush who studied the Word. Every morning that I saw him come to work, after I would say, when he walked from the Rose Garden into the Oval Office, "Good morning, Mr. President," and I'd tell him what his day was going to be like, he went and he sat at his desk, and he would read the Word. And he would do a devotional. He turned to the Word before he turned to the President's daily brief, the CIA document that everybody wants to see. And I was so proud that he did. I watched him wrestle with impossibly difficult challenges. I also watched him make decisions. He had the courage to make decisions. He had the discipline to make decisions. He had a friend helping him make those decisions. And it was a friend that was always with him. Didn't have to have a seat reserved on Air Force One. Didn't have to be called into a meeting in the Oval Office. That friend was there. And he knew it because of the Word. So, faith is really important. I cannot imagine being a man or a woman of great responsibility and meeting responsibility without being grounded in faith. Because the challenges that are so great require more help than we can find here. They have to be found there. There's something else about people like George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, or Archie Dunham. They also have to be optimists. I just cannot imagine a pessimist being a leader. Follow me, and things will get worse. oh, I think I'm going to make a bad decision today. Well, you can only find that optimism if you have faith. So my message to you is that you've honored a very worthy man, a man who walks with the Lord, a man who partners with his spouse, and they together live love. So I'm reflecting on those great works that have given us a nation, the Constitution, the invitation for all of us, the we. I'm grateful for the word that we have and our ability to work hard to understand it, knowing we will never fully understand it unless we have faith. Because we can't prove it. We just know it. And I'm grateful that all of those experiences that teach us to keep learning. Is there anybody that you know who is done reading the Bible? Do you know anybody who says, I passed the class? No. You have to live it every day. My wife is someone who lives it every day. She is a conscience for me. I wish she could be my insurance policy for what comes next, but it doesn't work that way. But I do tell you that I watched great men that are probably not as great as we think they are. But they are strong enough to recognize that they need help doing what allowed them to look great. And they sought it and they found it in the Word. So yes, I'm a Christian. I'm a sinner. I'm a teacher. I'm a learner. I love the Lord. I know the Lord loves me. And I know God's love is something that we aspire to have, but none of us really get it. So we have to work every day to find it. I don't know if you hate anybody, but try not to. It's really hard when you're in Washington, D.C. But it does make a difference. They will know we are Christians by our love. And it makes a difference. I'm going to close with this. I did stay in the Word when I was working at the White House. And it wasn't as hard as you might think, because my wife and I do get up very early in the morning, and the first thing that we do is go to the Word. And I don't think there have been very many mornings when my wife hasn't pulled me aside and said, put on the armor. Ephesians 6:10. You know, that armor is really important. But when you are cited in that little bit of biblical guidance for being one of those people in authority and in government who are the evil ones that we have to watch out for, and I'm thinking, I am they. But you know, think how nice it would be if everyone put on the armor of God every single day, so that we could work together to take out the dark forces of evil. Because there are dark forces of evil. And we don't always know it when we see them. And they do permeate. And when God is taken out, I think evil moves in. So I say, invite God everywhere and bring God with you everywhere you go. With that, I'd be glad to answer questions. And I didn't talk about any of the reasons why you know me. You only know me because there's a picture of me whispering in the president's ear on 9/11. My goal was to be a chief of staff, just the opposite of that bar in Boston called Cheers. Remember the song? Where everybody knows your name. I wanted to be the chief of staff where nobody knew his name. But that picture of me whispering in the president's ear did cause me to have celebrity that I didn't invite. It also caused me to be target practice in terrorist training camps, but that's another story. With that, I congratulate Archie and Linda, and I congratulate all of you. And I'd be glad to answer questions if there's time for me to do it, and I'll look at Charles to see if we have time for it. But if anybody has any questions, and I'm not afraid to answer controversial questions, so if anybody has a question, please speak up. Like Archie Dunham, I am hearing impaired. I have these little things in my ears to help me hear a little bit better. So if you have a question, speak up nice and loud. We have some mics. All right, I remember going to a meeting in New Jersey with a bunch of governors in 1984, where Richard Nixon was speaking with the governors. And he was amazing because he talked about the world and diplomacy and the challenges of Russia and China. It was just unbelievable. And then he opened the floor up to questions. He said, ask me any question you want, and the governors didn't ask any questions. And he says, wait a minute, I know you all have questions. At least you want to know about Watergate. So I know some of you may think I'm a war criminal. Ask me the question.
Voice. My question would be, I've always been curious about our President George W. Bush's decision not to editorialize about his views of what is happening right now with our wonderful country. Do you know that?
I don't want to say I know anything that George W. Bush knows, but I do know what his plans were. How's that? When he left the presidency, he indicated that, he is constitutionally irrelevant now, as he puts it. He's not allowed to be president anymore. There's a 2-term limit. He was also somewhat frustrated when other presidents, when they left office, didn't think they left office. And I'm not putting his dad in that category, because his father was extremely cognizant that there's one president at a time, and that the sitting president always knows more than the former president. Because even the former presidents don't get all of the classified documents. So he was very deferential to his son. But there were some former presidents that would opine without picking up the phone to offer advice and counsel. And President Bush said that was not how he was going to be as a former president. He was going to allow the president to be the president. Does he have views? Yes. Does he express them? Yes. Is he looking to change the debate in America? No. But he is extremely disciplined. I truly love the Bushes. I'm not even objective about them. I just love them. And President Bush number 41 is one of the most remarkable people I've ever met, and so is his wife. And I think his contributions to this nation are far more than people realize. George W. Bush is so much better than the American people believe, and that frustrates me because he's a man of great courage and conviction, and he made unbelievably tough decisions. I didn't agree with every decision he made. I respected how he made every decision that he made, literally every one of them, and I respected that they were his decisions to make. And so I love him, and I respect him. But he made a conscious decision not to try to be a president in trying to motivate responses of another president, and he also was not looking to be the political force in our party. The Constitution said he was done, and he said, I'm done, and he moved on. By the way, he's a very good painter now. Who would have thought? Very good painter. He's phenomenally disciplined about staying in shape, which he always was when he was president. He is so excited that he's going to be a grandfather. He loves his wife. He loves his children. He adores his dad and his mother. And he can't talk about his dad without crying almost now. So in fact, the whole Bush family is a great love story for America. And I'm going to do one pitch. I have to do one pitch. All the Best is a book of letters written by George H.W. Bush. It was published first several years ago. They just came out with a second edition with a new chapter in it. I'm pleading with you to buy the book. It's fabulous. The letters are phenomenal. There are letters to his son while he's president, letters to journalists about his son being president, which are phenomenal. There's letters to the kids and grandkids and great-granddaughter. Please get the book. All the proceeds go to the Bush School at Texas A&M. Yes.
Secretary Card, you paid great deference to the Constitution of the United States. You mentioned the first word, we. What are the responsibilities of we when the holder of the office of the president does not do I?
I'm going to exercise my First Amendment rights. I don't think successful leaders can be I leaders. I think they must be we leaders. I don't know what the world's record is for I, but I think Barack Obama may have it. And I'm troubled because it's not just that he uses I when he talks about things that he wants to do. He doesn't use the word we when more than he did it. So you don't hear him talking even about his cabinet very much. I mean, he's got a relatively invisible cabinet. He doesn't use the term, we can solve this problem with Congress. He doesn't use the term, we can work together as a nation. And so I'm troubled that the first word in the Constitution, he may see as I. And I think to be successful, he has to recognize that it's a we. And if the we is a very inviting word too. You know, just the word we kind of invites you in, doesn't it? And I don't feel as if he has invited all of us in to help find some of the solutions that cannot be found unless more people than he decides to help. So that would be my criticism of him. Although I am sympathetic, I carry a little empathy. I have a lot of empathy for any chief of staff. By the way, you do not take a job as chief of staff. You make a commitment as chief of staff. My days started, I would be at the office between 5:30 and 5:45 a.m. I did not go home until the president went to bed. The good news is George W. went to bed early. The job is 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. We all remember the television commercials from Hillary Clinton, you know, who's going to answer the phone at 3 a.m. and all this kind of stuff. What are you going to say? If there's a 3 a.m. phone call, there's been a 1 a.m. and a 2 a.m. phone call to the chief of staff. And chances are they held the issue so that there was no 3 o'clock phone call to the president. So it is, I would sleep with my BlackBerry on my chest. Literally. And I seldom got a call from the president in the middle of the night. I frequently got a call from the Speaker of the House in the middle of the night. Because I think if you're a member of Congress, you have to be a vampire. They just don't work well when the sun is up.
Mr. Secretary, what was the toughest decision you had to make as the Secretary of Transportation?
What was the toughest decision I had to make as Secretary of Transportation? Probably the most rewarding challenges had nothing to do with being Secretary of Transportation, except it happened while I was Secretary of Transportation. And that was when I got a call from James A. Baker III, but it was a very different phone call than the one I got after I had lost for governor. It was one where he was in a job that he didn't want. He was Chief of Staff to the President, giving up the Secretary of State's job. And Hurricane Andrew hit Florida and Louisiana. And Secretary Baker, Chief of Staff Baker, called me up and he said, Andy, if the President calls you tomorrow morning and asks you to go to Florida to take over the relief effort for Hurricane Andrew, will you say yes? Because if you're going to say no, I don't want him to call. That's another thing the chiefs of staff do all the time. And so I huddled with my staff and they say, no, say no, you don't want to do it, don't go anywhere near a disaster. Now, Rahm Emanuel would have said, great opportunity. But over the objections of my staff, I said, if the President wants me to go, I will go. And I called Secretary Baker back and I said, I don't think I'm the best person to send, but if the President wants me, I will go. Now that doesn't sound like a tough decision, but showing up in Dade County, Florida, was shocking to me. Because I arrived and went to the heart of where the hurricane had hit, and there was no one there except victims. There were no police officials or National Guard troops, no Red Cross, no Salvation Army. And I remember jumping off of a helicopter and walking around a neighborhood and seeing elderly people literally drinking water out of a puddle on the street. Roofs torn off houses and elderly women sitting in rocking chairs crying. And it ended up being a situation where I thought I was flying down to Florida to do a quick flyover, walk through, meet with officials, and then fly back to Washington, D.C. and report on it. I stayed there for 7 weeks. And I jumped in with both feet. And I remember being in the disaster assistance office for the local county when the disaster official was literally holding a press conference outside of her office saying, where's the cavalry, where's the president, he's nowhere to be found. I was sitting in her office waiting to meet with her, the representative of the president, with help. And I was very frustrated. So probably my experience dealing with the aftermath of Hurricane Andrew, where it was a disaster upon a disaster, was very frustrating. It was also the most rewarding experience I had in government. because I saw how people were helped by government. I also saw how people were helped by faith. The first meetings that took place in the disaster area were meetings at churches. The best responses came from the Southern Baptist Convention and the Mennonites and the Salvation Army. Sure, the government was there to help, but the first help came from the faith community, and they didn't ask permission. They just did it. So it was both my most difficult time and my most rewarding experience. And yes, being chief of staff was the most heady experience. Probably, you know, when you're a secretary, when you're secretary of transportation, a cool thing about the secretary of transportation that isn't there anymore, I was the commander-in-chief of the Coast Guard. There was only one other commander-in-chief in government, and he was the president. I kept saying to the president, when are we going to have a commanders-in-chiefs meeting? Didn't happen. Any other questions? Yes. Making hard decisions. Well, you should understand, first of all, in the White House, anyone who worked for me, I should say, anyone who worked for the president who had to report through me to the president, because there's a caste system at the White House. President! The vice president's like an understudy in a play. Then you have the chief of staff, then you have all the assistants to the president, then you have deputy assistants to the president, then special assistants to the president, and they all report directly to the president. And then you have directors and associate directors, and they report to people who report to the president. Well, everyone who was a special assistant to the president or above was appointed by the president, and I would meet with them. I tried to meet with them individually, and I said, ethics is more important than your job. Every one of you has a conscience. It goes beyond the rules, beyond the law. You know whether you are doing something right or wrong. You know if you did something right or wrong. And you know if you're being asked to do something right or wrong. I want you to find out what your own test is. And whenever you think you failed the test, come and tell me or the White House counsel. It's more important than your job. The other thing I said to him, anytime you need to see the president, go see the president. And wow, they love that. I said, anytime you want to see the president, you better not go. If it's not a real need, don't waste his time. Time was the only commodity that we had no control over. I did not want anyone to waste the president's time. But in terms of making tough decisions, I would want to know, why is the decision coming to me? What do I have to learn about the options? When is the decision required? And what are the consequences of getting it wrong? I say that because that's a question that we don't ask usually. Because you may get it wrong. And it would be good to know what the consequences are so you can mitigate the consequence. I also want to know who had to make the decision. Is it just a government decision? Or is it a presidential decision? If it's a government decision, where does the responsibility rest? Are you just trying to push it into the chief of staff's office? Or really is it a decision that should be made at the Secretary of Health and Human Services? But I would say understanding why the decision is necessary, when it must be made, and what the consequences of it being wrong would be, and then let's make it. And be an optimist. Try to collect as much information as you can, but don't allow the search for perfection to get in the way of perfectly good. You know, being in the academic world now, boy, is it frustrating. I've come to realize there's a different language in that business. Sorry, Mr. President. If you are a leader in an academic world, you have had phenomenal tunnel vision. And you have discovered a truth that was never discovered before, and you wrote about it, and your peers reviewed it and said, it's a truth. And then you're called a leader. In my world, a leader is someone who gets something to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do for the greater good. So, leaders in my world need peripheral vision. Leaders in your world need tunnel vision. However, leaders with peripheral vision need to find the people with tunnel vision to better understand the problem. So I would try to discover which tunnel vision leaders do we need to understand the problem, and what does the peripheral vision look like so that the context of the problem will be relevant to the people affected by it. And my final example on this one is, I remember it was August, and 3 of our really smart people at the White House came breathlessly into my office and said, we're done, we're done. And I knew what they were working on. They were working on Social Security reform, and they had their report done. They were done. And they were so proud, and they said, we'd like it announced next week. I said, it will not be announced next week. But we're done. I said, there's no one home. Congress is gone. The A-team from the media is gone. The think tank leaders are gone, and the French are on vacation. We're not going to announce it next week. And they said, oh, I said, it's going to have to wait till the middle of September, after the UN General Assembly, because the world focuses on the world for the first 2 weeks of September. And they said, oh, we were planning to take vacation then. That's where tunnel vision had an expectation that peripheral vision trashed. And I find that frequently happens, and that's why I think one of the most important things for a leader is to have peripheral vision, but know where the people are who have good tunnel vision. I think I've overstayed my welcome. Celebrate your faith. Praise the Lord. Trust and obey. And pay attention to Philippians 4:8. Pay attention to Ephesians 6:10, put on that armor. And you know what? Remember Ecclesiastes. There is always a season, and you've got to go with the flow. Thank you very much, and God bless you.